What if I told you, long before pyramids, before cities, before the first written word, there was a civilization so old that time itself seems to have forgotten it? Its people lived not in shadows, but in a dawn where the world was young, when rivers carved the first maps into the earth, and firelight was the language of survival. They built homes where no stone should have stood. They planted seeds in soils no hand had yet touched. They carried knowledge that whispers even now through broken ruins, traces of a kingdom too ancient for our history books to remember. But their greatness was fragile. Beneath the order they carved into the world, there was struggle, hunger, and a silence growing between the stars. Their monuments crumbled, their voices vanished, and what remains is a question. Who were they? The first to call themselves a people. This is the story of that forgotten dawn. The glory they reached for, the mysteries they left behind, and the long sleep into which they finally fell. Stay with me until the end, because once you glimpse the world's first civilization, you'll never see human history the same way again. If you're new here, like and subscribe, and in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now close your eyes and return with me to the oldest civilization, the first chapter in the story of us all. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of two vast rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, their waters winding through an otherwise harsh and unforgiving landscape. This is southern Mesopotamia, roughly 6,000 years ago. The land appears flat and featureless, but to the early settlers, it was filled with both promise and danger. Here, between unpredictable floods and scorching sun, human beings shaped one of the earliest civilizations, the Sumerians. The soil of this land was paradoxical. Left untamed, the rivers could devastate entire settlements with sudden flooding. Left untilled, the ground hardened into cracked earth under the relentless sun. And yet, with careful irrigation, canals carved by hand, and endless hours of labor, the same earth could yield barley, dates, and lentils. It was this fragile balance that convinced scattered communities of hunter-gatherers to settle permanently and transform the land into the cradle of civilization. To the Sumerians, survival was not simply about adapting to nature, it was about reshaping it. Early villages grew into towns, and towns eventually grew into cities. By 4000 BCE, names like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash began to emerge from the dust. But before monumental temples and royal palaces dominated the skyline, life revolved around small mud brick homes, built side by side, connected by narrow alleyways. Each home had little more than a single hearth for cooking, a few reed mats for sleeping, and clay jars for storing water and grain. Privacy was scarce, but community was everything. Daily life was filled with routines, women grinding grain, men maintaining irrigation ditches, and children carrying water from the river in clay pots almost too heavy for their small arms. Life was repetitive, slow, and often backbreaking. And yet it was in this environment that humanity's first great leap into civilization began. One of the most remarkable aspects of early Sumer was its dependence on cooperation. Canals required entire communities to maintain. A single broken embankment could flood acres of fields and ruin months of work. Neighbors depended on each other, not out of kindness, but necessity. This cooperation eventually developed into political structures, as some individuals rose to organize labor, settle disputes, and distribute resources. Leadership, in these earliest days, was less about crowns and thrones, and more about who could ensure the barley crop survived. Yet, step by step, power consolidated, and the earliest forms of kingship emerged. But kings alone did not define Sumer. At the heart of each settlement stood the temple, not merely a place of worship, but the center of economic life. Priests oversaw offerings, but they also managed grain storage, land distribution, and the hiring of laborers. In many ways, Temples were the first bureaucracies, keeping clay tablet records of goods received and workers employed. Religion and administration blurred into one. To the Sumerian mind, the gods were inseparable from daily survival, and offering barley or sheep to the temple was as much about divine favor as it was about ensuring the redistribution of resources during lean times. Daily routines reflected this deep interconnection of faith and necessity. Farmers began their mornings not only by checking irrigation channels, but also by leaving offerings at household shrines, small clay figurines representing protective spirits. Children learned early that their survival depended on forces larger than themselves: the river, the weather, and the gods. A poor harvest was not just bad luck, it was interpreted as divine displeasure. This worldview shaped everything from the construction of canals to the timing of festivals. Even in such an early stage, the seeds of urban complexity were visible. Clay tokens were used for counting, small impressions that would one day evolve into the first written language. Pottery styles shifted from purely functional to decorated, marking wealth and status. Trade routes began to stretch outward, bringing in lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and timber from the Levant. Although Sumer seemed geographically isolated, its people were already reaching beyond their river valleys, laying the foundation for the first interconnected world. And yet, despite the signs of progress, life remained precarious. Crops could fail, floods could destroy entire districts, disease spread quickly in crowded cities with no sewage systems. Children often did not survive past infancy, and adults rarely lived beyond their 30s. Each day was an act of resilience, each season a gamble against forces they could barely predict or control. It is perhaps this fragility that explains why the Sumerians built their lives so closely around both community and gods. To face the river alone was to invite ruin. To face it as a people, with rituals and rules, offered at least a chance of survival. As you imagine lying in the stillness of a Sumerian night, the sounds would have been both familiar and strange. The distant barking of dogs, the croaking of frogs in the irrigation canals, the soft murmur of families telling stories by oil lamps made of clay. Above, the vast Mesopotamian sky stretched with stars, stars that Sumerians would one day learn to map, count, and read as signs of divine will. But in these early days, the stars were simply lights above a world they were still struggling to understand. And so, the dawn of Sumer was not marked by sudden inventions or great kings, but by countless ordinary people who endured the monotony and hardships of daily survival. Their story is one of mud, grain, and water, dull details that, piece by piece, built the foundation of history's first civilization. Yet one question lingers as we pause here. How did these fragile villages of mud and barley transform into cities that would shape the entire world? The transformation from scattered farming hamlets into the world's first cities was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, over centuries, as necessity pushed human communities into closer cooperation. Where once a cluster of reed huts had sufficed, now stone foundations and sun-dried mud brick houses began to dominate. The rivers demanded discipline, and the land itself required order. Canals, irrigation ditches, and embankments could not be managed by a few families alone. Entire communities labored together, carving water channels under the heat of the Mesopotamian sun, ensuring the fields of barley and dates remained alive. This dependence on shared effort gradually wove the strands of social hierarchy, as those who organized work came to hold greater influence. Uruk, one of the earliest and most celebrated Sumerian cities, became a model of this shift. Its name still lingers in the memory of history, not because of myth alone, but because it embodied the very essence of early urbanism. Archaeological layers reveal walls that stretched miles, enclosing temples, markets, and homes. Yet behind this grand structure was a slow accumulation of effort. Brick by brick, canal by canal, ordinary Sumerians shaped a city that would be remembered as the birthplace of civilization. Life in Uruk was not glamorous for most. Farmers trudged daily to fields beyond the city, returning with baskets of grain. Craftsmen worked with clay, copper, or stone, shaping tools and vessels that filled both temples and markets. Traders carried goods on the backs of donkeys, venturing into distant lands for wood, metals, and rare stones. The rise of temples as centers of life reveals how tightly bound religion and governance were. At the core of Uruk stood the Temple of Inanna, towering above surrounding dwellings. It was not only a house of worship, but also a warehouse, a bank, and a political hub. Grain was measured and stored within its walls, ensuring that during droughts or floods, distribution could continue. Clay tablets recording these transactions show that long before coins, faith and economy were inseparable. Those who served the temple became more than spiritual guides. They were administrators, record keepers, and managers of resources. To walk into a temple courtyard was to step into the pulse of the city itself. Daily rhythms followed the cycles of farming, trade, and ritual. Market days filled the air with the sounds of bargaining. Jars of oil, baskets of dates, bundles of reeds, and woven textiles all exchanged hands. Families brought surplus crops, hoping to trade for tools or pottery. Children ran through narrow streets, their feet stirring up dust between the walls of homes pressed tightly together. Animals roamed freely, goats nibbling at scraps, donkeys braying under heavy loads, dogs sniffing through alleyways. Life was noisy, crowded, and often uncomfortable, but it was also connected, with every household tied into the fabric of the city. The invention of writing became the most profound development of this period. At first, it was not intended for poetry or storytelling, but for the simple act of counting. Clay tokens, once used as physical tallies, gave way to impressions on clay tablets. These impressions evolved into symbols, and those symbols eventually formed cuneiform. A farmer could now have his grain counted, recorded, and tracked. A temple could manage its stores without relying solely on memory. Over time, scribes emerged as a distinct class, their long training giving them authority in both economic and religious matters. The ability to write transformed power, for those who controlled the written record controlled the memory of the city. Beyond writing, other inventions marked Sumerian life. The wheel, first used for pottery, soon became essential for transport. Plows, drawn by oxen, allowed farmers to work larger plots with greater efficiency. These advancements might seem mundane compared to kings and myths, but they carried the weight of survival. Each new tool made it possible to feed more people, to sustain larger settlements, and to allow specialization beyond farming. The shoemaker, the brewer, the weaver, and the scribe could only exist because the farmer's harvest supported them. Yet beneath this growth lay constant fragility. The rivers that gave life could also bring ruin. Too much water meant floods, too little meant famine. Droughts tested the resilience of communities, sometimes leading to migrations, sometimes sparking conflict between neighboring cities over access to canals and farmland. It was in these struggles that the first organized armies emerged, not vast, legions, but small groups of men armed with spears, axes, and shields. City walls rose higher, not just as a show of strength, but as a daily necessity for protection. Life in early Mesopotamia was a balance between cooperation within and defense without. The shift from simple villages to organized cities also reshaped how people saw themselves. No longer defined solely by family or clan, individuals now belonged to a larger whole. To say, "I am from Uruk," or "I serve the temple of Inanna" carried meaning beyond kinship. Identity expanded, tied to land, gods, and the rhythm of urban life. The stories people told around evening fires began to reflect this change, weaving myths of kings who spoke with gods, of temples blessed by divine hands, of rivers flowing according to heavenly design. Even so, ordinary life remained filled with quiet labor. Women prepared bread from barley, brewing beer in great clay jars that bubbled in the corner of courtyards. Men patched roofs made of reeds and mud plaster, ensuring homes could withstand the rains. Children learned early to work, fetching water, grinding grain or helping in the fields. Amid the noise of growth, the heart of Sumer still beat through simple acts of survival. And yet, as cities like Uruk expanded, new questions emerged. Who had the right to rule? Who could claim ownership of land and water? Who truly spoke for the gods? These questions, still unresolved in the dawn of civilization, would soon lead to the rise of kingship, codes of law, and struggles for power that defined the next stage of Mesopotamian life. But before kings carved their names into clay tablets and warriors marched behind banners, there was the quieter transformation, the gradual shaping of communities into cities. Here, among bricks, canals, and clay tablets, humanity discovered what it meant to live together on a scale never seen before. And as you imagine those crowded streets and the endless work that sustained them, a question lingers. How did these growing cities transform from fragile hubs of survival into powerful centers ruled by kings and remembered in epic tales? As Sumerian cities grew larger and more complex, the need for leadership shifted from temporary organizers of irrigation to permanent rulers. Authority could no longer remain in the hands of priests alone, for temples controlled the gods' wealth, but not always the city's defense. When disputes arose between settlements over land or water, it became clear that someone had to lead warriors, negotiate peace, and enforce order. Thus, the institution of kingship emerged, and with it, the foundation of political power as we understand it today. The earliest kings were not simply rulers, they were seen as intermediaries between people and gods. A king's legitimacy rested on divine favor. He was expected to maintain justice, protect temples, and ensure that the canals flowed. In return, the people gave him loyalty, labor, and often their sons for service in his army. Unlike later monarchs who claimed absolute power, these early kings still worked closely with priests. Religion remained inseparable from politics, but the balance had shifted. A city now had two centers of authority, the temple and the palace. Uruk, again, provides the clearest example. Archaeologists have uncovered the so-called White Temple and the nearby palace complexes, showing the physical proximity of faith and power. In art, kings were often depicted leading processions to the gods, presenting offerings as proof of their devotion. Yet their role went beyond ritual. They oversaw the building of walls, organized the digging of canals, and enforced rules of exchange in the markets. A city could not function without grain storage or irrigation, but neither could it survive without order. To bring that order, Sumerians turned to something revolutionary: written laws. Before Hammurabi's famous code, there was the Code of Ur-Nammu, a text that reveals much about daily life in Sumer, around 2100 BCE. These laws were practical, dealing with theft, property disputes, marriage, and injury. The punishments were often fines rather than physical retribution, showing an early attempt to balance fairness with survival. Justice was not abstract. It was about keeping harmony in a society where cooperation was essential. For a farmer, the knowledge that the law would protect his field from encroachment or theft gave a sense of stability. For a merchant, it meant trust in trade. For the city as a whole, it bound together people who otherwise might have fallen into conflict. Amid this legal and political structure, culture flourished. The Sumerians left behind the world's first great literary work, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Though filled with myth, the story reflects real concerns of the time: kingship, mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. It tells of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His quest for immortality mirrors the struggles of his people. How to leave a lasting mark in a world where floods, droughts, and death threatened constantly. That this story was written in cuneiform, copied and read for centuries, demonstrates how far writing had come since its humble beginnings as grain tallies. From counting jars of barley to exploring the meaning of life, Writing became the thread that carried human memory forward. Daily life, however, remained tied to the basics of survival. While kings built temples and poets wrote epics, the majority of Sumerians still woke to tend fields, fetch water, and repair walls. Women wove textiles, brewed beer, and oversaw households, while men dug irrigation ditches or crafted tools. Yet even in these routines, the presence of kingship and law was felt. Taxes in the form of grain supported temple workers and soldiers. Seasonal festivals brought the community together under royal and religious leadership. The city was not merely a place of work. It was a living organism, sustained by the efforts of thousands who may never have seen the king yet lived under his shadow. But Sumer's story was not one of unbroken progress. The very rivers that sustained civilization also carried its downfall. Shifting watercourses, salinization of the soil from over-irrigation, and cycles of drought weakened city-states. As resources grew scarce, conflicts intensified. Neighbor fought neighbor, and once thriving cities fell to decline. Akkadian invaders under Sargon eventually rose, conquering Sumerian cities and establishing one of the first empires. Yet even in conquest, the Sumerian legacy endured. Akkadian rulers adopted cuneiform, temple structures, and legal codes, carrying them forward into new forms. Looking back, the Sumerians may seem distant, their lives filled with mud bricks, barley fields, and clay tablets. Yet the patterns they established, kingship, laws, writing, trade, urban living, remain foundations of human society. They were not inventing civilization with a plan. They were simply responding to the challenges of survival: how to feed a community, how to share water, how to prevent conflict. Out of necessity came the structures we now recognize as the pillars of history. As you drift into the thought of their world, picture again the night in Uruk. A king sleeps in his palace. Priests count grain in temple stores. Farmers rest on reed mats after a long day, and scribes press symbols into soft clay by lamplight. Their world was fragile, but it was also enduring. Though the cities eventually fell, their influence flowed outward like the rivers themselves, shaping kingdoms yet unborn. And so the question lingers. If the first civilization rose from mud, water, and survival, what lessons might we carry into our own uncertain age, where power, law, and memory still hold us together, just as they did in Sumer? As the Sumerian world shifted from fragile villages into organized cities, leadership began to take new forms. In the earliest days, priests held sway because they claimed to interpret the will of the gods, and survival depended on divine favor. But as populations grew, canals stretched farther, and trade networks expanded, the demands of governance went beyond ritual. Practical authority was needed, someone to mobilize labor, resolve disputes, and defend city walls. Out of this necessity emerged the first kings of Uruk, rulers whose power was not written in gold or stone, but pressed into clay. Unlike later empires where monarchs ruled vast territories, these early kings presided over compact but intensely organized city-states. Their authority rested on a fragile balance: the trust of the people, the cooperation of priests, and the ability to keep order in a world where famine, floods, and raids were constant threats. Clay tablets reveal glimpses of this early kingship. Not heroic conquests, but administrative lists, rations distributed to workers, offerings made to temples, debts recorded for merchants. Power was measured not in jewels, but in the ability to track grain, assign labor, and enforce contracts. Uruk, with its massive walls and sprawling markets, became the model of this early kingship. Its rulers presided over a city unlike any other in the world at the time. The sheer scale of construction, vast temples, monumental ziggurats, and urban walls stretching kilometers, suggests a level of organization that could only exist under central leadership. And yet the king was not a tyrant above the people. His role was as much about coordination as command. To dig canals required thousands of hands. To defend the city demanded watchful guards. To maintain trade, meant ensuring safe passage for caravans. The king was the manager of a fragile organism, not simply its master. The most famous of these rulers, remembered not only in history but in epic, was Gilgamesh. His story, though wrapped in myth, reflects the anxieties of early kingship. He was remembered as part god, part man, a figure who could claim divine legitimacy while bearing the burdens of leadership. In the epic, his search for immortality speaks less to the supernatural and more to the enduring human question of legacy. How does a ruler ensure that his name, his city, and his people survive after his death? The answer, for Gilgamesh and those like him, lay in the building of walls, temples, and systems that outlasted individual lives. Archaeological evidence supports this view of kingship as pragmatic rather than purely ceremonial. Clay tablets catalogue shipments of stone from distant lands, suggesting royal oversight of long-distance trade. Records of temple offerings show a partnership between priests and kings in managing surplus. Even lists of workers, men and women alike, demonstrate the bureaucratic grip of leadership. For the ordinary Sumerian, the king's presence was felt not in grand proclamations, but in daily routines. The assignment of labor, the rationing of food, the scheduling of festivals. Life under these kings was defined by structure. Farmers knew when and where to plant because canals were managed centrally. Soldiers knew their duty because city defense was organized from above. Merchants relied on standardized measures of weight and volume, overseen by scribes working in service of the throne. In every clay tablet, from the tally of barley jars to the record of livestock, one sees the quiet weight of authority. To live in Uruk was to live under a system where the king's hand extended into every corner of life, not through visible force, but through the invisible thread of administration. And yet kingship was not without tension. Priests still commanded deep respect, and temples held wealth that rivaled the palace. A ruler who ignored the gods risked losing legitimacy, just as one who neglected canals risked losing his people. The delicate balance of divine approval and practical success shaped the earliest kings. In this way, their authority was never absolute. It was conditional, earned day by day in both ritual and labor. The clay tablets remind us that even in these early days, power was fragile. A ruler who failed to secure food or who allowed enemies to breach walls could see his authority crumble. Unlike later dynasties where bloodlines justified succession, here kingship often rose and fell with the city's fortunes. Stability depended not only on charisma, but also on competence. In a world so precarious, kingship was less about glory than about endurance. But as Uruk grew and its rulers became more ambitious, another question arose. Could a city-state be more than a center of survival? Could kings extend their reach beyond their own walls, binding together multiple cities under one rule? The ambition of rulers, reflected in both epic tales and administrative tablets, hinted at the first steps toward empire. And so we pause here, with Uruk's kings standing at the threshold of something larger. They had organized the first great city, pressed laws and records into clay, and built monuments that proclaimed their strength. Yet the horizon held new challenges: rival cities, expanding trade routes, and the temptation of conquest. Would these first kings remain caretakers of a single city, or would they reach for something greater, reshaping Mesopotamia forever? When the kings of Uruk first rose to prominence, their authority was bound closely to the city itself. But as Uruk grew in size and influence, its rulers began to think beyond canals and temples. The city's walls, stretching miles in circumference, became both a symbol of power and a practical necessity. According to tradition, Gilgamesh ordered the construction of these walls, and even centuries later, Sumerian scribes described them with awe. Built of sun-dried bricks, repaired and thickened over generations, they represented something new in human history. The idea that a city could not only protect itself, but also project permanence. These walls were not empty symbols. As trade routes extended, carrying grain, wool, and pottery outward in exchange for wood, copper, and precious stones, Uruk attracted both allies and rivals. Neighboring city-states watched the prosperity of Uruk with suspicion, and disputes over water or farmland often turned violent. Kings who once served primarily as coordinators of labor found themselves acting as generals, commanding bands of soldiers armed with bronze-tipped spears and axes. Warfare in these early times was brutal but small in scale. Skirmishes over irrigation channels, raids against storehouses, or sieges of modest fortifications. Yet each conflict hardened the role of the king as protector and defender, tying his legitimacy to the survival of the city. Clay tablets from this period preserve not the clash of armies, but the practical demands of war. Rations for troops, lists of weapons, tallies of livestock seized from defeated rivals. The administrative nature of these records underscores a simple truth. Power depended not only on courage but on supply. An army could not march without grain, nor could a city resist without stored water and organized defense. Thus, the expansion of Uruk's reach was as much a triumph of logistics as it was of ambition. But military power was only one facet of Uruk's growing dominance. The city also extended its influence through trade and cultural exchange. Merchants carried with them not only goods, but also practices, weights and measures, accounting systems, and religious rituals. Archaeological evidence shows Uruk-style pottery and seals appearing far beyond Mesopotamia, suggesting colonies or trading posts in distant lands. This spread of material culture reveals how kings used commerce as a tool of soft power. While armies defended borders, merchants expanded horizons, weaving Uruk into a network that stretched across the ancient Near East. The partnership between palace and temple deepened during this time. Kings needed the priests to sanctify their wars and justify their authority, while temples relied on royal power to secure land and resources. Together, they created an order where divine approval and political strength reinforced one another. Before a campaign, sacrifices were offered to Inanna or Anu. Victories were celebrated with processions and offerings. For ordinary citizens, these rituals framed warfare not as human conflict, but as the unfolding of divine will. When kings triumphed, it was proof that the gods favored them. When they failed, questions arose about whether the ruler had lost divine support. Daily life, meanwhile, continued under the shadow of these expanding ambitions. Farmers sowed and harvested according to the rhythms of the rivers, but their labor now supported not just their families and temples, but armies as well. Taxes in the form of barley or sheep sustained both soldiers and craftsmen who forged weapons. Children grew up in a world where service to the city was expected, whether through farming, building, or fighting. To be a citizen of Uruk was to live within a system where the king's reach extended into every field, every market, every household. The image of the king also began to change. No longer merely an organizer of labor, he was portrayed as a warrior, a builder, and a guardian of the people. Cylinder seals from this period show rulers slaying lions or leading prisoners, symbols not of everyday life, but of idealized kingship. Such images reinforce the idea that the king was more than human, chosen by the gods to embody strength and order. Yet behind the images lay fragile realities. Crops could fail, enemies could breach walls, and loyalty could fracture. The king's power remained contingent, tied to his ability to sustain both prosperity and protection. As Uruk's influence spread, the question of scale began to surface. Could a single city, no matter how great, dominate its neighbors indefinitely? Or would the demands of expansion require a new form of organization, something larger than a city-state? The seeds of empire lay within these early struggles, as rulers tested the limits of their reach. And so, as night fell over Uruk, the glow of oil lamps flickered against the massive city walls. Inside, scribes pressed records into clay, priests prepared offerings, soldiers sharpened their weapons, and farmers rested after another day in the fields. The city was alive, humming with the energy of ambition and anxiety. But the story of kingship was far from settled. Beyond Uruk's walls, other cities waited, rivals, allies, and potential subjects. The stage was set for a new experiment in power, the attempt to unite many under one rule. Would Uruk's kings succeed in transforming their authority into something enduring, or would their ambitions unravel under the weight of their own creation? By the height of Uruk's influence, kingship had become something more than a practical necessity. It was now a symbol, a role that carried the weight of divine favor, civic pride, and human ambition. The kings of Uruk were no longer remembered only as managers of canals or defenders of walls. They became figures who embodied the hopes and fears of their people. Through their actions, Mesopotamia witnessed the fragile beginnings of organized monarchy, a pattern that would echo across centuries of human history. What set Uruk apart was not simply its size, but the way its rulers shaped the very idea of leadership. Administrative tablets from this period show a level of organization that feels almost modern in its precision. Lists of workers assigned to projects, records of tribute from defeated cities, inventories of goods distributed to soldiers and temple staff. These seemingly dull entries reveal the core of early kingship. Authority was exercised through order. Without these records, without scribes trained to inscribe tiny wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, a king's power would have dissolved into chaos. But records alone could not guarantee stability. Kings also needed monuments to remind their people, and their rivals, of their strength. Temples were expanded, ziggurats rose higher, and walls were thickened. These projects were not only practical, but symbolic, proof that the city could endure. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king points to Uruk's walls as his greatest legacy, the lasting achievement that outlives human mortality. Whether Gilgamesh was a historical king or a mythologized figure, the sentiment was real. To rule meant not just to organize the present, but to carve permanence into the future. Yet, as Uruk expanded, the contradictions of kingship became harder to manage. A ruler was expected to embody divine will, yet he was also bound by human limitations. If floods destroyed the harvest, or enemies triumphed in battle, the king's legitimacy faltered. Priests might whisper that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Citizens might grumble that their labor built palaces while their fields lay barren. Kingship was never absolute. It was always fragile, tested with each season, each war, each drought. The broader legacy of Uruk's kings, however, lies in how they transformed political thought. Their reigns demonstrated that leadership could be institutional, not just personal. Clay tablets recording dynasties suggest that succession was beginning to be seen as a structured process, rather than a matter of chance. The king's role became a seat of power that could pass from one man to another, embedding monarchy into the identity of the city. Even when rulers fell, the institution of kingship endured. Outside Uruk, the influence of its rulers spread. Neighboring cities adopted similar structures, balancing temples with palaces, priests with kings. Some resisted, others imitated, but all were drawn into the orbit of a world where leadership was no longer temporary or tribal, but civic and enduring. This model of kingship, blending divine sanction with bureaucratic control, would ripple outward, shaping Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. And yet, the kings of Uruk were not remembered solely for their successes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the most enduring legacy of Uruk's age, preserves a tension between human ambition and mortality. Gilgamesh builds walls, defeats rivals, and seeks immortality, but ultimately confronts the limits of human life. His story reflects the truth of early kingship. No matter how strong the ruler, time and death would prevail. What endured was not the man, but the structures he left behind. Walls of brick, systems of law, records pressed into clay. For the people of Uruk, daily life continued much as before. Farmers bent over barley fields, Scribes pressed symbols into tablets, women spun wool into textiles, children carried water jars from canals. But above their ordinary routines loomed the memory of kings who had shaped the city, built its defenses, and claimed the favor of the gods. Even if their reigns faded, their names remained etched in myth and clay alike, tying human effort to divine destiny. By the time later rulers and empires looked back to Uruk, the city itself had already begun to decline. Shifting rivers and environmental strain weakened its foundations, and new powers rose to overshadow it. Yet Uruk's experiment in kingship had already changed the course of history. It had demonstrated that power could be organized, recorded, and legitimized in ways that endured beyond a single generation. And so, the legacy of Uruk's kings rests not in their victories alone, but in the questions they left behind. How should power be balanced between faith and rule? How does a leader earn legitimacy in the eyes of both gods and people? How does a city preserve its memory when rulers, like all mortals, inevitably fall? The clay tablets, silent yet enduring, carry fragments of answers. They remind us that power, once measured in grain and rations, laid the groundwork for the empires to come. And as the stars rose over Uruk's great walls, the city itself became a monument, not just to its kings, but to the birth of an idea that still shapes the world. The idea that human communities can be held together by leadership, law, and memory. And so, as Uruk faded into history, another question began to stir. What new inventions, beyond kings and walls, would carry humanity even further along the path of civilization? When the kings of Uruk consolidated power, their authority depended not only on soldiers, temples, and walls, but on something subtler: the ability to keep track of life's endless details. A city of tens of thousands required grain to be stored, livestock to be counted, taxes to be managed, and labor to be distributed. Words spoken aloud could be forgotten, but marks impressed into clay endured. Out of this necessity, the first writing system in human history emerged: cuneiform. The origins of writing were far humbler than literature or law codes. They began with small clay tokens shaped into cones, spheres, or discs. Each token represented a specific commodity: a sheep, a jar of oil, a measure of barley. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes called bullae, sealed and marked to show what was inside. Over time, scribes realized it was simpler to press the image of the token into the surface of the clay itself, avoiding the need to store physical objects. This shift from three-dimensional tokens to two-dimensional impressions marked the beginning of recorded symbols. It was a quiet but world-changing step. Abstraction. By around 3200 BCE, the impressions became more standardized, evolving into pictographs. A simple wedge might mean grain, while another mark meant livestock. Over time, scribes discovered that with enough combinations, symbols could represent not just objects, but sounds and ideas. This transformation, from tallying goods to expressing language, is what we now recognize as writing. The system came to be known as cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped stylus used to impress marks into clay tablets. The role of the scribe grew alongside this invention. Training was long and difficult, requiring years of memorization and practice. Young students sat in schools, called edubus, learning to form hundreds of signs. They copied lists of words, proverbs, and phrases until their hands grew sore from pressing reeds into clay. Failure was met with harsh discipline. Some tablets preserve the complaints of students who grumbled about beatings from their teachers. Yet for those who endured, the reward was status and influence. Scribes became indispensable, serving temples, palaces, and merchants alike. For ordinary people, writing was distant but transformative. A farmer might never learn the script himself, but he knew that his harvest could be recorded, his debts tracked, his disputes settled with a tablet as witness. For the first time, Memory no longer relied solely on human recollection. Clay preserved agreements across seasons, even across generations. The permanence of writing gave stability to a society where floods, droughts, and wars could otherwise erase the past in an instant. The early tablets reveal the daily concerns of Sumerian life. They list jars of beer distributed to workers, sheep offered to temples, shipments of grain moved from one city to another. There are no grand stories here, no poetry or philosophy. Only the careful, sometimes monotonous accounting of survival. Yet within this monotony lies the foundation of history. Without writing, Uruk could never have grown beyond a small settlement. Without records, trade would falter, taxes would vanish, and justice could not be enforced. Writing was the invisible scaffolding that held civilization together. Temples and palaces quickly realized the power of this new tool. Priests used writing to track offerings and manage temple lands. Kings used it to proclaim laws and record victories. Merchants used it to secure contracts that could be enforced even when memory failed. In every sphere of life, cuneiform extended human capacity to organize, recall, and govern. The city was no longer dependent on fragile oral agreements. It could now bind its people together through clay. But the leap from tokens to tablets carried more than administrative weight. It changed the very way people thought about knowledge. When words could be fixed, they could be studied, compared, and taught. Lists of plants, animals, and professions appear in early tablets, suggesting that scribes were already categorizing the world around them. Writing was not only about survival, it was the beginning of systematic thought. The act of pressing wedges into clay also altered the relationship between people and time. Spoken words vanish as soon as they are uttered, but written signs endure. A promise recorded on a tablet carried weight precisely because it could not be forgotten. This permanence gave writing a power that transcended administration. It made agreements sacred, laws unbreakable, and history preservable. And yet, in these early centuries, writing was not intended for everyone. Literacy was the privilege of the few, and scribes guarded their knowledge carefully. For the majority of Sumerians, writing remained a distant mystery, a world of symbols seen only on tablets handled by priests or merchants. Still, even if they could not read the marks, they felt their impact. Writing quietly reshaped the structures of daily life, linking each individual act of labor to the greater machinery of the city. So when we look back on Uruk and its kings, it is not only their walls and temples that endure, but these fragile clay tablets. Baked by accident in ancient fires, they survive to this day, carrying lists of barley, names of workers, and debts long since forgotten by their makers. They remind us that the first writing was not born out of poetry, but out of grain. And as we pause here, one question emerges. How did a system created for counting jars and sheep evolve into the medium through which humanity told its greatest stories? Once scribes had mastered the art of recording barley and sheep, it was inevitable that writing would stretch into new purposes. The clay tablet, initially a tool for managing grain stores, slowly transformed into a vessel for memory, law, and imagination. By the 3rd millennium BCE, writing was no longer confined to accountancy. It became a medium through which kings proclaimed authority, priests preserved rituals, and poets sought to capture the voices of gods and heroes. The first great leap came with law. Oral customs had long dictated justice, but spoken words could shift with memory or bias. When disputes arose over land, water, or debt, testimony often conflicted. Writing offered something fixed. Kings began to inscribe decrees into clay, setting rules that could be referenced across seasons. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi by centuries, reveals this shift. Punishments for theft, compensation for injury, protections for widows and orphans. Each clause was carved into permanence, transforming the fleeting nature of speech into lasting record. For citizens, the law was no longer hidden in the memories of elders. It was pressed into clay for all to see. At the same time, religion found its voice in writing. Temples that once relied on oral chants began to preserve hymns and prayers. Some of the earliest tablets contain invocations to gods, asking for protection, fertility, or victory. These written prayers ensured that rituals could be repeated precisely, binding communities together through consistency. In a world where divine favor was tied to survival, the ability to preserve sacred words gave writing a spiritual gravity. The gods themselves, it seemed, now spoke through clay. But perhaps the most striking expansion came with literature. Over centuries, scribes moved from listing goods to capturing stories. Myths that had once been told by firelight were now recorded, passed down across generations with remarkable fidelity. Tales of gods battling chaos, of kings guided by divine dreams, of heroes seeking immortality, all found their way onto tablets. The most famous of these was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a work that fused history and myth, personal struggle, and cosmic order. Written in successive versions over centuries, it illustrates how writing transformed memory into a collective inheritance. Education grew alongside this literary flowering. The Aduba, or tablet house, became the school where future scribes endured years of training. Students began their lessons with simple lists, trees, animals, professions. They then copied proverbs, moral sayings, and passages of law. Discipline was strict. Surviving tablets preserved the laments of students who complained of harsh teachers and endless drills. Yet the system produced scribes capable not only of administration, but of preserving the intellectual fabric of their culture. Through them, cuneiform spread across Mesopotamia, becoming the lingua franca of diplomacy and learning for centuries. The spread of writing also reshaped identity. Kings could now proclaim victories far beyond their own lifetimes. Merchants could enforce contracts across distant lands. Families could preserve genealogies, anchoring themselves to the past. Writing created continuity, linking the living to their ancestors and projecting memory forward to future generations. A farmer might remain illiterate, but he lived in a world where his name could appear on a tablet, where his labor could be tallied, where his disputes could be settled by written law. He was part of a civilization that now existed not only in the present moment, but in recorded time. The materiality of writing also mattered. Clay tablets were durable, yet heavy. Scribes developed techniques for different uses. Small tablets for daily accounts, large ones for archives, cylindrical seals to mark ownership or authenticity. In temple storehouses, thousands of tablets accumulated, creating the first true archives. These collections were not accidental. They were deliberate attempts to preserve knowledge. For the first time in human history, information was no longer wholly at the mercy of memory or chance. Beyond Sumer, cuneiform spread to neighboring cultures. Elamites, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all adapted it, each shaping the script to their own languages. What began as barley tallies in Uruk became a shared system of communication across empires. Letters between kings of different lands, diplomatic correspondence carved into clay, testify to this remarkable reach. Writing had transcended the city. It had become the backbone of international relations. Yet, even as writing expanded, it retained traces of its origins. Many tablets still detail rations, debts, and harvests. The bureaucratic impulse never disappeared because it was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without the surplus tracked by scribes, temples, and palaces could not build monuments or sponsor literature. Every epic, every law code, every prayer was ultimately supported by the quiet, relentless record-keeping of accountants. Civilization advanced on the back of ledgers. The shift from numbers to narratives reveals something profound about humanity. Once we discovered how to fix words into material form, we could not stop at accounting. We longed to preserve not just what we owned, but who we were, what we believed, and what we feared. The clay tablet became a mirror of the human condition. Practical yet imaginative, mundane yet transcendent. And so, from the ledgers of Uruk emerged the first voices of history. They spoke of law, of ritual, of heroes, of grief, of hope. They ensured that generations long vanished could still be heard. But this expansion also raises a question that lingered in the Sumerian mind and still echoes today. If writing could preserve memory, could it also grant immortality, not to kings or gods, but to the very words themselves? By the time cuneiform matured into a fully developed script, its role had far surpassed the management of temples and fields. It had become the single greatest tool of continuity in a region where civilizations rose and fell with startling frequency. Kings could be overthrown, cities burned, and dynasties erased, but the clay tablets often survived. Accidentally baked in the fires of conquest, these fragile pieces of earth preserved voices that otherwise would have vanished. Writing had created a paradox. Even when people perished, their words endured. One of the most striking consequences of this permanence was the way memory shifted from oral tradition to written archive. In oral cultures, stories lived only as long as they were retold. With writing, knowledge could leap across generations without distortion. A scribe copying a hymn centuries after its first composition was not merely repeating words. He was preserving a spiritual link to ancestors who had long since returned to dust. In this way, writing transformed time itself. The present was no longer confined to the living. It stretched backward into the remembered past and forward into an imagined future. Archives became the beating heart of Mesopotamian cities. Palaces stored records of tribute and treaties. Temples preserved rituals, hymns, and astronomical observations. Some cities accumulated thousands of tablets, carefully arranged in rooms that functioned as the world's first libraries. The act of collecting and categorizing texts was itself revolutionary. It suggested that knowledge had value beyond immediate use, that information was a resource to be guarded, studied, and passed on. Within these archives lay not just records of trade, but seeds of philosophy, science, and literature. For rulers, the power of writing was inseparable from legitimacy. Kings commissioned monumental inscriptions on stone and clay, proclaiming victories, building projects, and divine favor. Unlike oral boasts, these written declarations could not be easily denied. They were etched into public spaces and sacred sites, embedding authority into the very landscape. A king who inscribed his deeds into clay could claim a permanence that his fragile life could never secure. In a sense, writing became a weapon, not of war, but of memory. The effect extended even into diplomacy. Letters exchanged between distant courts, written in cuneiform on clay, demonstrate the first international communication preserved in history. Kings of Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia corresponded with each other, negotiating marriages, alliances, and trade. These letters reveal that writing was no longer a local tool, but a shared language of power, binding distant lands through the permanence of script. Yet, writing's greatest achievement was not in power or bureaucracy, but in its capacity to capture human thought. Among the thousands of tablets unearthed are not only lists and contracts, but laments, proverbs, riddles, and reflections on mortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, copied and recopied, demonstrates this transition vividly. Here was a story that began as oral myth, transformed into written literature, and ultimately became a meditation on what it means to live and die. Writing gave voice to the most intimate struggles of the human soul. For ordinary people, the impact of writing remained indirect but profound. They might not have learned cuneiform themselves, but they lived within a system structured by it. Their debts, marriages, land boundaries, and taxes were preserved in clay. Their rulers' legitimacy rested on inscriptions carved in their name. Their gods were worshipped through written hymns that had been repeated for centuries. Even if they never held a stylus, writing shaped their lives from cradle to grave. And yet, the invention carried risks as well as gifts. By fixing words into permanence, it also froze them. Oral tradition allowed stories to adapt, but writing anchored them in place. Authority shifted toward those who could interpret the script, the scribes and priests, creating a hierarchy of knowledge. Literacy became a gate to power, and those excluded remained dependent on interpreters. This tension, born in Sumer, would persist across civilizations for millennia. Despite its limitations, writing remained the most enduring creation of Mesopotamia. The walls of Uruk crumbled, the palaces of kings turned to rubble, but the tablets endured beneath the soil. Today, when archaeologists uncover these fragments, they hear echoes of voices from 5,000 years ago. Workers tallying rations, kings boasting of triumphs, poets lamenting mortality. Each mark pressed into clay is a reminder that the desire to be remembered is as old as civilization itself. The invention of writing thus represents more than a technological leap. It is the moment humanity discovered how to extend memory beyond the limits of flesh. Through writing, people of the past could speak to the future. Through writing, the dead could instruct the living. Through writing, history itself became possible. And as we reflect on those first marks pressed into clay, one thought lingers. If the Sumerians found immortality not in their bodies, but in their words, how might our own records, etched into screens, stored in vast digital archives, shape the memory of our age thousands of years from now? As writing spread and kingship solidified, Sumerian cities turned their attention to something even more enduring, the construction of monumental temples. In a land where the horizon was flat and the rivers stretched endlessly, the ziggurat rose like a man-made mountain, built layer by layer of mud, brick, plastered with bitumen, and faced with kiln-fired bricks. These massive stepped structures became the focal point of urban life. To see a ziggurat towering above the mud brick homes and bustling markets of a Sumerian city was to glimpse the meeting point between heaven and earth. The origins of the ziggurat lie in the simple temple. Early shrines were little more than huts of reeds or small brick platforms where offerings could be placed. But as cities grew wealthier and rulers more ambitious, temples swelled in size and complexity. Each enlargement brought new tiers, higher stairways, and grander facades. What began as modest altars became colossal monuments visible for miles across the plain. For the Sumerians, this was no mere architecture. It was theology in brick. They believed their gods lived in the sky, and so they built mountains where none existed, platforms upon which the divine might descend. The daily labor of building these structures fell not on kings or priests, but on ordinary people. Workers hauled clay from riverbanks, mixed it with straw, and pressed it into molds for bricks. These bricks, left to dry under the scorching sun, were stacked in endless rows, forming the solid core of the ziggurat. To strengthen the outer walls, specialized craftsmen fired bricks in kilns, coating them with protective glazes. Bitumen, a natural tar found in the region, was used as mortar, binding the structure together. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and often dangerous under the relentless heat. Yet it was also collective. Entire communities labored together, bound by obligation, taxation, or religious duty. Priests oversaw not only the rituals of the temple, but also its construction. They dictated dimensions, selected auspicious days for beginning the work, and offered sacrifices to ensure divine favor. In their view, every brick laid was an act of devotion, every tier a step toward the gods. The ziggurat was not just a building, it was a bridge between the human and divine realms. For ordinary workers, this belief provided meaning to otherwise grueling labor. To build a temple was to participate in the city's survival, to ensure the gods remained pleased, and to secure blessings for harvests and protection from disaster. Life around the ziggurat reflected its central importance. Each morning, priests climbed its stairways to present offerings, bowls of barley, jugs of beer, or incense burned to carry prayers heavenward. Rituals punctuated the rhythm of the city, marking planting seasons, harvests, and festivals. At the base of the temple, storehouses brimmed with grain, oil, and wool, resources managed by temple administrators and distributed as rations to workers, soldiers, and scribes. The ziggurat was therefore not only a spiritual center, but also an economic hub, intertwining faith with survival. For builders, daily routines revolved around the relentless demands of construction. Mud was hauled in baskets, scaffolding, erected from wooden poles, and ramps built of earth to drag bricks upward. Songs and chants often accompanied the work, a cadence that bound laborers together. While some workers were conscripted, others were paid in rations of barley, bread, and beer. These small compensations tied their survival directly to the progress of the temple. In effect, the city itself was built around the act of building for the gods. Archaeological remains show that ziggurats were not hollow shells, but carefully engineered structures. Drains were built to divert rainwater, staircases aligned with celestial markers, and bricks stamped with the names of kings who commissioned them. These inscriptions ensured that future generations would remember who had raised the sacred mountain. To climb the ziggurat was to walk upon the legacy of rulers and the devotion of thousands of anonymous hands. Yet, even in their grandeur, ziggurats were vulnerable. Constructed mostly of sun-dried mud brick, they eroded quickly without constant maintenance. Each generation repaired and rebuilt, layer upon layer, reinforcing the old with the new. The ziggurat was thus both eternal and fragile, an enduring symbol that demanded continual labor. In this way, it mirrored the city itself, lasting only so long as its people remained committed to its upkeep. Standing at the heart of the city, the ziggurat embodied the union of faith, power, and labor. It was a monument that proclaimed not only devotion to the gods, but also the ability of human beings to organize, endure, and create something larger than themselves. The kings who sponsored them gained prestige, the priests who managed them secured influence, and the people who built them found meaning in shared sacrifice. But behind the majesty of the towering temple lay an unresolved question. Were these mountains of brick truly houses for the gods, or were they monuments to human ambition disguised as devotion? Once the towering ziggurat had been raised from thousands of mud bricks, its true life began inside the temples and courtyards that surrounded it. To the ordinary citizen, the ziggurat was a mountain they could see but never fully enter. Only the priests, the chosen intermediaries between people and the divine, had access to the sacred chambers above. They were the keepers of ritual, the guardians of memory, and the administrators of wealth. If kings embodied power in public, priests carried authority in silence, guiding the unseen bonds that held the city together. The daily routine of a priest began before sunrise. At the first light, temple doors were opened, incense was lit, and offerings were laid before the statues of the gods. These statues, carved from wood and adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones, were not seen as mere symbols, but as living presences. Priests washed and clothed them, presented them with food and drink, and recited hymns to honor their names. To neglect a ritual was unthinkable. The health of the city, its crops, and its people depended on maintaining divine favor. Beyond ritual, priests managed the temple's vast economic resources. The ziggurat complex was not only a place of worship, but also a storehouse and an administrative center. Fields owned by the temple stretched across the land, worked by farmers whose harvests were brought into storage rooms at the base of the temple. Scribes, employed by the priesthood, recorded every measure of barley and every head of livestock that entered or left. This bureaucracy ensured that the temple remained the wealthiest institution in the city, rivaling the palace itself. In times of famine, it was the temple that redistributed food, reinforcing the belief that the gods themselves sustained the people. Festivals punctuated the year, turning the ziggurat into the center of public life. On appointed days, priests carried statues of the gods through the streets in processions, accompanied by music, dancing, and feasting. These ceremonies were not mere displays of devotion. They reaffirmed the unity of the city. When citizens gathered to watch their god ascend or descend from the ziggurat, they were reminded that their labor, their taxes, and their lives all tied back to a larger cosmic order. The priests, standing at the heart of these rituals, became both spiritual leaders and civic anchors. The education of priests was rigorous. Many began as young boys in the Aduba, the tablet house, where they studied alongside scribes. They memorized hymns, mastered complex rituals, and learned to interpret omens. For in addition to conducting ceremonies, priests were also tasked with reading the signs of the gods. The flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the pattern of oil poured into water, all were scrutinized as messages from the divine. A king might command armies, but he often sought the approval of priests before launching a campaign or beginning construction. The fate of the city seemed to rest as much on these quiet interpretations as on soldiers or walls. Inside the ziggurat, the atmosphere was hushed and heavy with incense. While ordinary citizens could approach outer courtyards to leave offerings, only select priests entered the inner sanctum. There, away from the noise of markets and fields, they performed rituals unseen by the people below. The secrecy added to their authority. To many, the priests seemed to walk in a world hidden from ordinary eyes, carrying knowledge that lay beyond human reach. This aura of mystery made them indispensable but also feared. A mistake in ritual, an unfavorable omen, or a poorly interpreted sign could bring unrest, for the people believed the gods had turned away. At the same time, the life of priests was not without hardship. Rituals demanded strict discipline, including fasting, purification, and long hours of chanting. Their days were filled with repetition, copying hymns, and overseeing endless sacrifices. Unlike kings, whose victories were celebrated, in epic and stone, priests lived in cycles of ceremony, rarely remembered by name. Their work was thankless but essential, the invisible labor of devotion that sustained the city's spiritual framework. The relationship between priests and kings was complex. At times they stood united, one blessing the other's rule. At other times, tension arose when kings sought to expand their authority beyond ritual boundaries. Priests could not wield armies, but they controlled divine legitimacy. A king who ruled without priestly sanction risked rebellion or divine condemnation. In this delicate balance, the ziggurat stood as a physical reminder. Both palace and temple claimed the city's center, but only together could they maintain order. Around the ziggurat, life for ordinary citizens was shaped by these unseen powers. Farmers brought their offerings, craftsmen delivered goods, and families prayed for blessings. They may not have climbed the temple steps, but they believed their fates were decided in those hidden chambers above. To them, the priests were not just men, but conduits, ensuring that the gods heard their cries and answered their needs. And yet, a question lingered even then, whispered perhaps by workers in the fields or mothers in their homes. Were the gods truly moved by these endless rituals? Or was it the priests themselves who shaped the destiny of the city through the power of ceremony and control? Though centuries have passed since the first mud bricks were laid, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia remain among the most striking legacies of the ancient world. Their towering presence dominated not only the skyline of early cities, but also the imagination of generations. Rising above the flat plains, these temples declared that human hands could fashion a mountain where none existed, a stairway from earth to the heavens. For the people who lived in their shadow, the ziggurat was not just a structure of clay, but the very heart of their community, binding faith, politics, and survival into one. Unlike palaces, which crumbled when dynasties fell, or markets, which shifted with trade, the ziggurat was a constant. Each generation repaired its bricks, reinforced its foundations, and raised its tiers higher. In this way, it became a symbol of continuity, linking ancestors to descendants. To stand before it was to feel part of a story larger than any single lifetime. Even kings who sought glory through conquest and monuments recognized that their names endured best when stamped into the bricks of the temple. The influence of ziggurats extended far beyond their original builders. Later civilizations across Mesopotamia, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Chaldeans, adopted and expanded the form, each raising their own versions of the sacred mountain. The most famous of these, the Great Ziggurat of Babylon, inspired stories that echoed far beyond Mesopotamia, remembered later as the Tower of Babel. The idea that humans might climb toward the divine through monumental construction captured imaginations for millennia. What began as a Sumerian temple became a universal symbol of aspiration and ambition. Yet the legacy of these structures was not purely spiritual. Ziggurats also shaped the development of architecture and urban planning. They established the principle that the center of a city must house not only power, but meaning. Surrounding neighborhoods radiated from the temple, with markets clustered nearby and administrative buildings close at hand. The ziggurat was both the literal and symbolic anchor, ensuring that cities grew around their gods. In this way, architecture itself became an expression of belief. To build higher was to seek the heavens. To place the temple at the center was to acknowledge divine authority. The daily life of priests and builders faded into obscurity, but their work endured in every layer of brick. The chants of priests no longer echo in the stairways, and the hands that carried clay have long returned to dust. Yet the structures remain, weathered but standing, testifying to the collective devotion of countless unnamed people. In their silence, the ziggurats remind us that civilization is often built not by the famous alone, but by the labor of the many whose names were never written on tablets. For the Sumerians, the ziggurat was the dwelling place of gods. For later generations, it became a memory of how faith and ambition could reshape landscapes. And for us today, it is a window into the ancient world, showing how ordinary labor, organized belief, and communal sacrifice could produce something both fragile and eternal. But even as we marvel at these structures, one question lingers. Did the ziggurats truly connect humanity with the heavens? Or did they reveal instead our unending desire to leave behind monuments that outlast the fleeting span of human life? With ziggurats rising at their centers and kings and priests shaping authority, Sumerian cities became more than clusters of homes. They became living organisms. To walk the streets of Uruk, Ur, or Lagash was to enter a world unlike anything humanity had known before. Crowds filled narrow alleys, markets spilled into courtyards, and walls enclosed entire populations within carefully planned spaces. The invention of the city changed how humans experience community, identity, and survival. At their foundation, these cities were built not of stone, but of mud. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates lacked quarries of marble or forests of timber, so the Sumerians turned to the most abundant material at hand, river clay. Shaped into bricks and dried in the sun, this humble substance became the backbone of urban life. Homes, walls, workshops, and even palaces were made of the same material. Over time, layers of mud brick construction piled upon one another, giving the cities a layered quality, one generation building upon the ruins of the last. The earth itself became both the foundation and the memory of the city. Daily life unfolded in a rhythm both monotonous and bustling. Streets were narrow, winding paths that carried the smells of smoke, animals, and refuse. Children played with clay toys while weaving through donkeys and goats. Merchants shouted prices over the noise of hammers, looms, and grinding stones. Women pounded grain into flour, their work filling courtyards with the rhythmic sound of pestles. Men repaired tools, cut reeds, or carried baskets of mud for construction. The city was alive with labor, every corner filled with the small repetitive acts that kept the larger system functioning. Markets became the heart of urban exchange. Unlike small villages where barter sufficed, cities required organization. Merchants gathered in open spaces, laying out goods on mats or in clay jars. There was grain and bread for daily survival, woolen textiles dyed in rich colors, oils pressed from seeds, and pottery shaped in countless forms. Exotic goods also appeared: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Oman. These items testified to the reach of Sumerian trade, carried across vast networks that connected river valleys to distant lands. The city was not an isolated entity, but a node in a larger web of exchange. The growth of cities also brought new challenges. Crowding was a constant reality. Families lived in small mud brick homes pressed tightly together, often sharing walls with neighbors. Courtyards served as kitchens, workshops, and gathering spaces. Waste disposal was crude, and disease spread easily in such confined quarters. Noise never ceased. Animals brayed, craftsmen worked, and sellers called out. For those accustomed to quieter rural life, the city could feel overwhelming, yet it also offered opportunities that villages could not. Access to trade, protection behind walls, and connection to temples and kings. Religion remained woven into every aspect of urban life. Even outside the great ziggurats, small shrines dotted neighborhoods where families left offerings of bread or beer. Festivals transformed the city into a theater of devotion, as statues of gods were carried through crowded streets in elaborate processions. In these moments, the entire community felt united, whether farmer or craftsman, slave or merchant. The city itself became a stage on which the gods were honored, and daily hardship was given meaning. Law and order were also tested within city walls. With so many people packed into small spaces, disputes were inevitable. Property boundaries blurred, debts multiplied, and tempers flared in crowded markets. Written laws gave structure, but enforcement often fell to local officials or elders who mediated in courtyards. Justice was not always fair, but it provided enough stability for the city to function. For most citizens, the presence of scribes and officials offered at least some assurance that life was not governed purely by chance or strength. Despite the noise, the heat, and the hardships, there was a sense of pride in city life. To say one came from Uruk or Ur was to claim belonging to something greater than oneself. The city offered identity, protection, and continuity. Its walls sheltered not just people, but the memory of generations. While a farmer in the countryside might vanish without record, a citizen of the city could see his name pressed into clay, his labor tied to monuments, his life woven into the broader fabric of civilization. At night, when the streets finally grew quiet, families gathered in their small courtyards. Oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows on mud brick walls. Conversations drifted upward into the open sky, filled with stars that stretched endlessly above the plain. In those quiet hours, the city seemed both fragile and eternal, a collection of ordinary lives bound together in extraordinary patterns. But as cities grew larger and more complex, new questions emerged. Could these crowded streets and fragile mud walls truly sustain growing populations? Or would the demands of urban life push humanity toward new forms of organization and control? As the earliest cities expanded, survival could no longer rest solely on farming. The crowded streets of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash demanded a different kind of economy, one built on specialization. Not every citizen could tend fields or herd flocks. Some baked bread, others brewed beer, others spun wool, or shaped clay into vessels. The city thrived because its people divided labor, each profession supporting the next, all bound together by trade. Markets reflected this growing interdependence. A potter might trade jars for barley, a brewer might exchange beer for wool, and a carpenter might sell reed furniture in return for bread. These exchanges were rarely simple barter. Scribes often recorded transactions on clay tablets, noting quantities, debts, and obligations. Over time, a system of standardized measures and weights emerged, ensuring fairness in trade. The presence of scales, seals, and tablets at markets reveals how deeply administration was embedded even in everyday commerce. Trade also pushed cities outward. connecting them to lands far beyond Mesopotamia. Caravans laden with goods crossed deserts and mountains, bringing resources unavailable on the floodplain. Copper arrived from Oman, tin from Anatolia, and timber from the forests of Lebanon. Lapis lazuli traveled astonishing distances from mines in Afghanistan, prized for its deep blue color that adorned jewelry and temple decorations. In exchange, Sumerian textiles, grain, and crafted goods spread outward, carrying the identity of the cities with them. These networks transformed Sumer from an isolated valley into part of a vast web of exchange. Within the city, specialization gave rise to entire classes of workers. Weavers operated in workshops where dozens of women spun wool into cloth, overseen by temple administrators. Bakers supplied bread not only to families, but to armies, and workers engaged in building projects. Brewers perfected recipes for beer, which became a staple of daily consumption. Metalworkers shaped copper into tools and ornaments, while stonecutters carved cylinder seals that served as both art and legal signatures. Each profession tied survival not only to agriculture but to craft, making the city a place of constant production. This shift towards specialization also created hierarchies. Those who worked with their hands often lived modestly, while scribes, priests, and merchants gained wealth and status through control of trade and records. Kings, of course, stood at the top, claiming tribute from all. Yet even within the lower classes, pride existed in skill. A well-crafted jar or finely woven textile carried recognition, ensuring that artisans had a place in the city's identity. The streets of Uruk or Ur were filled not just with farmers, but with makers, each contributing to the city's fabric. The presence of so many professions demanded organization. Temples often served as central hubs, collecting goods, redistributing them, and paying workers in rations of barley or beer. Palaces, too, managed labor, assigning workers to fields, workshops, or construction. This system blurred the line between economic and political life. To work in a city was not just to provide for one's family, but to serve the larger machinery of the temple and the king. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every woven cloth tied back to institutions that anchored society. The growth of exchange also reshaped daily rhythms. Markets no longer served only local needs. They became vibrant spaces where foreign merchants appeared with strange accents and unfamiliar goods. New ideas traveled alongside materials, religious practices, artistic styles, and technologies spread from city to city. In this way, trade became not only an economic engine, but also a cultural bridge, weaving Mesopotamia into the wider human story. For ordinary people, the effects were felt in small but significant ways. A family might adorn their home with beads of foreign stone, or a craftsman might experiment with new techniques learned from travelers. Children grew up in cities where the world outside the walls was not a distant mystery, but a source of goods and stories. The city was no longer only a collection of neighbors, it was a participant in a broader, interconnected world. Yet with these new opportunities came challenges. The reliance on trade made cities vulnerable to disruption. A failed caravan, a hostile raid, or a shortage of imported resources could unsettle entire economies. Specialization also tied workers more tightly to institutions, leaving them dependent on temple or palace rations. The very complexity that gave cities their strength also introduced fragility. Still, the momentum was undeniable. The city was no longer an experiment. It had become a way of life. The mud brick walls, the bustling markets, the chants of priests, and the clamor of craftsmen together formed the essence of urban existence. To live in a city was to participate in something larger, something that bound together survival, identity, and ambition. But as these networks grew stronger and cities more complex, a deeper question emerged. Could the delicate balance of trade, labor, and hierarchy endure? Or would the weight of growth eventually strain the very foundations that made the first cities possible. The rise of the first cities was a triumph of human organization, yet beneath their mud brick walls lay deep vulnerabilities. Unlike mountains or forests, cities were fragile creations, dependent on canals, trade routes, and constant human effort. A blocked waterway, a failed harvest, or a caravan lost in the desert could shake the balance on which thousands of lives depended. What seemed like permanence was, in truth, a delicate equilibrium maintained only through vigilance. The rivers that had given birth to urban life were both benefactors and threats. When floods were gentle, they renewed the fields. When they raged, they drowned homes and destroyed canals. Salinization of soil from over-irrigation reduced fertility, forcing farmers to abandon fields that had once been productive. As populations grew, the demands on land and water intensified, often sparking disputes between neighboring cities. These conflicts could escalate into war, leaving markets empty and storehouses plundered. A city could fall not only to external enemies, but to the silent pressures of its own environment. Disease, too, thrived in crowded quarters. With animals roaming streets and waste disposal minimal, epidemics swept through neighborhoods quickly. Families packed into small mud brick homes lived in close contact, and what one household suffered often spread to many others. Though unseen, illness was as much a threat to city life as drought or invasion. It reminded people that while walls could keep out raiders, they could not shield them from the dangers that flourished within. Still, the resilience of these cities was remarkable. When floods destroyed homes, families rebuilt. When soil turned barren, canals were extended to new fields. When wars raged, survivors repaired walls and markets. This persistence reveals something profound. The city was no longer just a place, it was an idea. To abandon it entirely was unthinkable. Even when one city fell, another rose, carrying forward the same patterns of walls, markets, temples, and streets. The rhythm of urban life endured, even as specific places shifted in fortune. Over time, these early cities left an indelible mark on human history. They pioneered systems of governance, trade, and record-keeping that became the foundations of later empires. They demonstrated the possibilities and perils of concentrated human life, showing that cooperation could achieve greatness, but that fragility was always near. Their crowded streets, once noisy with barter and labor, became echoes in the archaeological record. Layers of mud brick and broken pottery, testifying to generations who lived, worked, and died within their walls. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the first cities lies not in their ruins, but in the pattern they set. The principles of urban life, division of labor, reliance on trade, need for governance, and dependence on infrastructure, continue to shape our modern cities. The same questions that haunted Uruk or Lagash remain relevant today. How can resources be shared fairly? How can order be maintained in crowded spaces? How can fragile systems withstand the pressures of growth? At night, under the same stars that once shone on Sumerian rooftops, the ancient cities remind us of both continuity and fragility. The mud bricks have crumbled, but the idea of the city as a place where people gather, trade, worship, and dream endures. The Sumerians built not just walls and streets, but a blueprint for the way humans would live together for millennia. And so, as the dust of their ruins whispers across the plains of Mesopotamia, one question lingers. Did the first cities fall because they were too fragile, or because humanity had already set in motion a cycle of growth and collapse that would repeat throughout history? As the first cities of Mesopotamia grew into crowded networks of streets, markets, and workshops, the question of order became inescapable. Thousands of people, pressed inside mud brick walls, could not live together without rules. Neighbors quarreled over boundaries, merchants disputed debts, workers clashed with employers, and families argued over inheritance. Without a framework, every disagreement threatened to become a feud, every insult a cause for violence. Kings and priests could not watch every corner, so they turned to something more enduring than their voices: law written into clay. Long before Hammurabi's famous stele, another set of laws guided Mesopotamian life, the Code of Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu was king of Ur around the 21st century BCE, ruling at a time when the city had regained prominence after centuries of upheaval. He inherited a fragile world, scarred by wars between rival cities and weakened by environmental pressures. To secure unity, he recognized that power must rest not only on armies or temples, but on fairness. His code, among the oldest legal texts known, reveals a vision of society where disputes were resolved not by vengeance, but by compensation, where order was built not on fear alone, but on balance. The laws of Ur-Nammu were written in Sumerian, pressed into clay by scribes who worked in palace archives. Unlike later codes carved into stone for all to see, these laws were stored in collections, consulted by judges, and preserved for reference. Yet their impact was immense. They provided a guide for daily life, ensuring that justice did not depend solely on the memory or whim of officials. To live under Ur-Nammu's code was to enter a world where even the smallest dispute could be weighed against a written standard. The content of the laws reveals much about the priorities of early urban society. Theft was punished, not by execution, but by fines. Injuries were compensated with payments of silver. Adultery and false accusations carried specific consequences, but again, often resolved through restitution rather than brutal retribution. In this sense, the Code of Ur-Nammu shows a society seeking stability through fairness rather than fear. Where later codes would impose an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's leaned toward resolution through balance, recognizing that survival depended on cooperation more than cruelty. Daily disputes reflect the fabric of life in the city. A farmer might accuse his neighbor of diverting water from a canal. A merchant might claim that a buyer refused to pay for grain. A craftsman might argue that his wages had been withheld. Each case threatened the fragile trust on which city life depended. By providing a written framework, the laws acted as a neutral reference point. Justice became less about strength or persuasion and more about adherence to recognized standards. The existence of fines and compensation also reveals the growing importance of silver in trade. While most of Sumerian life was still rooted in barter, the use of silver as a medium of exchange was expanding. By requiring payments in silver for many offenses, Ur-Nammu's code strengthened the role of currency in daily life. The law was not only about justice, it was about reinforcing the economic systems that sustained the city. Behind the code lay a deeper philosophy, the belief that kingship carried responsibility for justice. Ur-Nammu presented himself not just as a warrior or a builder, but as a shepherd of his people. In his prologue to the laws, he claimed that the gods had appointed him to establish equity, to protect the weak from the strong, and to ensure harmony in the land. Whether this was propaganda or genuine conviction, it shaped the image of kingship in Mesopotamia. A good ruler was one who brought not only prosperity, but also fairness. For ordinary citizens, the code gave a sense of predictability. Even if they could not read the tablets themselves, they knew that disputes could be judged according to established rules. This reduced the risk of endless cycles of revenge. If a crime could be compensated, then families could move forward without carrying grudges for generations. The laws, in their quiet way, became a glue that held the city together, just as much as walls or canals. Yet, the existence of law also highlighted divisions. Fines differed depending on status. Punishments could be harsher or lighter depending on whether the offender was free, enslaved, or noble. Equality before the law was not yet imagined. Still, the fact that laws applied across classes at all, that even nobles might be fined or merchants punished, was a remarkable step in a world still emerging from tribal customs. The Code of Ur-Nammu reminds us that civilization was not only built with bricks and grain, but with rules. To live together in crowded cities required trust, and trust required standards. These standards were not perfect, nor were they always fair, but they represented an attempt to replace chaos with order, vengeance with structure. In their simplicity, the laws carry echoes of every society that followed, from Hammurabi's Babylon to modern courts today. And so, as we reflect on these fragile clay tablets inscribed 4,000 years ago, one question remains. Did Ur-Nammu's laws truly create justice, or did they merely reflect the struggle of early societies to balance power with survival? Once the code of Ur-Nammu had been inscribed into clay, it did not simply sit in archives as silent words. The code became the living framework through which daily conflicts were judged, interpreted, and resolved. Within the crowded cities of Ur and Uruk, justice was not an abstract idea. It was a process carried out in dusty courtyards, temple precincts, and palace chambers where scribes recorded testimonies and judges weighed disputes. The code provided guidance, but it was people, with their biases, wisdom, and limitations, who brought those rules into practice. Judges in Sumer were often drawn from respected officials or elders, individuals trusted to interpret both law and custom. They presided over hearings where citizens presented their claims. The scene was rarely grand. Two neighbors standing before an official, one accusing the other of diverting a canal, stealing livestock, or withholding payment. Witnesses might be called, evidence discussed, and scribes pressed the details into clay tablets. The goal was not spectacle, but resolution. In a society where cooperation kept canals flowing and crops growing, lingering disputes could threaten the survival of all. Swift and structured judgments allowed communities to move forward without the shadow of revenge. Scribes were indispensable to this process. Trained in the laborious art of cuneiform, they sat beside judges and recorded proceedings. Their tablets preserve fragments of real disputes, lists of payments, contracts, marriages, and even adoption records. In one case, a tablet records compensation for an injury. In another, repayment of a debt. These mundane documents reveal the daily heartbeat of justice. Without scribes, the law would have been spoken and forgotten. With them, it became permanent, binding memory into clay. Their presence ensured that verdicts could be enforced months or even years later, preventing the erosion of trust. For the citizens who stood before these judges, the code of Ur-Nammu was both protection and boundary. A farmer who accused his neighbor of stealing water knew that the case would not dissolve into endless feud. A merchant cheated in trade could demand restitution measured in silver. A family wronged by injury could expect compensation rather than bloodshed. The law did not erase inequality. Nobles and the wealthy still enjoyed advantages. But it provided a framework that reduced chaos. In a city where thousands lived in close quarters, that framework was as essential as food and water. Interestingly, the code emphasized fines and restitution rather than physical punishment. This approach reflected both practicality and philosophy. In an economy dependent on labor, maiming or killing offenders would have weakened the workforce. Fines, by contrast, not only punished, but redistributed wealth, ensuring that losses were compensated and society continued to function. This suggests a vision of justice rooted in balance rather than destruction, a recognition that cities could not afford cycles of violence. Marriage and family life also fell under the code's reach. Tablets preserve rules about inheritance, dowries, and marital conduct. A widow, for instance, could inherit property, ensuring her survival after her husband's death. Children, too, were protected in matters of legitimacy and inheritance. These laws reveal a society deeply concerned with continuity, the smooth transfer of land, wealth, and responsibility across generations. In the instability of ancient Mesopotamia, where famine and war loomed constantly, family law was as critical as rules about theft or trade. Temples often served as centers of legal activity. Disputes might be heard in courtyards before shrines, reinforcing the idea that justice was not merely human, but divine. To swear an oath before the gods was to place one's honesty under sacred scrutiny. False testimony was dangerous, not only because it carried legal penalties, but because it risked divine wrath. Thus, law, religion, and survival intertwined in ways that shaped how people understood justice. The process of justice also reveals how literacy deepened power structures. Most citizens could not read the tablets that recorded their cases. They relied on scribes and judges to interpret the law. This dependence gave literate elites great influence, creating an early division between those who shaped justice and those who simply lived under it. Yet, paradoxically, it also spread trust. Because records were fixed, citizens could believe that their disputes would not vanish into memory or favoritism. Even without literacy, they knew that the written word carried permanence that no single person could erase. The Code of Ur-Nammu, then, was more than a list of rules. It was a living system that reshaped how people interacted in crowded cities. It allowed strangers to trade with confidence, neighbors to share canals without constant violence, and families to preserve their legacies across generations. Justice became not a private act of vengeance, but a shared commitment to balance, preserved in clay and sanctioned by both king and gods. Yet, one cannot ignore the limitations. Justice was never equal. Wealthy merchants could pay fines easily, while the poor might struggle under penalties that crippled them. Nobles received different treatment than commoners, and slaves had few protections. Still, even with its inequities, the system offered something extraordinary for its time: predictability. In a world of floods, droughts, and invasions, the law gave a measure of certainty that life otherwise lacked. As we imagine these courtrooms under the blazing Mesopotamian sun, with judges seated on reed mats, scribes pressing styluses into clay, and citizens pleading their cases, the scene feels distant yet familiar. The human desire for fairness, for resolution, for a system that rises above personal quarrels, was as strong then as it is now. The Code of Ur-Nammu, humble though it was, gave shape to that desire. But the story does not end with its daily use, for in time, these principles would inspire new rulers, new codes, and harsher interpretations. Ur-Nammu's vision of balance would give way to Hammurabi's eye for an eye, as later kings sought to project authority through fear as much as fairness. And so a question lingers as we pause here. Was Ur-Nammu's gentler vision of justice a fleeting experiment, or did it plant the seeds of legal tradition that still shape our ideas of fairness today? The Code of Ur-Nammu did not exist in isolation. It was born in a specific moment of Mesopotamian history, when the city of Ur had reasserted itself after years of turmoil. Ur-Nammu's reign sought to restore balance, both politically and socially, by binding the people together under a shared sense of justice. For a time, his code succeeded in reducing conflict, stabilizing trade, and strengthening the authority of kingship. Yet, as with all human creations, its permanence depended on the survival of the kingdom that enforced it. Ur-Nammu's dynasty did not last forever. His successors struggled against both external threats and internal pressures. The fragile network of canals, fields, and trade routes that sustained the city could be disrupted by drought, invasion, or rebellion. As the kingdom weakened, the code, once a living framework, became increasingly difficult to enforce. Without strong kingship, laws written in clay lost their power, for justice depends as much on authority as on rules. When Ur eventually fell to rival powers, the code faded from daily practice, surviving only in scattered tablets preserved by chance. Yet the influence of Ur-Nammu's laws reached far beyond his lifetime. Later rulers across Mesopotamia recognized the need for written codes to maintain order in growing cities and empires. The famous Code of Hammurabi, composed centuries later in Babylon, built upon this precedent. While Hammurabi's laws were harsher, emphasizing retribution, an eye for an eye, the very idea of a written public code was rooted in earlier traditions like Ur-Nammu's. His emphasis on compensation fairness, and stability set the foundation for the evolution of legal systems across the ancient Near East. The contrast between Ur-Nammu's approach and Hammurabi's reveals a shift in how rulers conceived of justice. Ur-Nammu's code was pragmatic, focused on keeping communities stable through restitution. Hammurabi's, by contrast, sought to project authority and instill fear, reflecting the demands of a larger, more diverse empire. Where Ur-Nammu had emphasized restoring balance, Hammurabi emphasized punishment as a deterrent. Both systems reveal truths about their societies, one dependent on cooperation among neighbors, the other on centralized power over conquered peoples. For the ordinary citizen, the difference was profound. Under Ur-Nammu, a farmer injured in a dispute might receive silver as compensation, allowing life to continue. Under Hammurabi, the same situation could result in physical retaliation, leaving scars that reminded the community of the king's authority. In both cases, the law was a tool of order, but the spirit behind it differed. The comparison highlights how law is never neutral. It reflects the vision of those who wield it. Even as Ur-Nammu's kingdom collapsed, his experiment in written law left an enduring legacy. The very act of inscribing justice into clay established the principle that rules could outlast rulers. Words pressed into tablets became more permanent than speeches shouted in markets or decrees announced in courtyards. This permanence changed the relationship between ruler and subject. A king might die, but the law could survive. In this way, the Code of Ur-Nammu represents one of the earliest steps toward the idea of law as an institution independent of individual will. Archaeologists who uncovered fragments of the code thousands of years later were struck not only by its antiquity, but by its humanity. The concerns it addressed, theft, injury, marriage, inheritance, are the concerns of every society. To read these tablets is to glimpse lives once lived, a farmer demanding fairness, a widow securing her rights, a judge striving to balance equity with authority. These voices, though faint, remind us that the struggle for justice is as old as civilization itself. The legacy of Ur-Nammu is therefore not confined to the ruins of Ur, nor to the faded power of his dynasty. It lies in the recognition that law is essential to community, that justice must be more than vengeance, and that stability depends on predictability. His code may have been forgotten for centuries, but its principles continue to ripple through Mesopotamian culture, shaping the expectations of kings, priests, and citizens alike. And when we reflect on this moment, the first attempt to bind a city together with rules pressed into clay, we confront a question that has never truly been answered. Is justice created by rulers as a tool of control, or does it emerge from the shared need of people to live together in peace? Long before scribes wrote down the laws of Ur-Nammu or the decrees of Hammurabi, they recorded something older, deeper, and more haunting. Stories of a flood that had once swept across the world, destroying cities, kingdoms, and lives. These tales, pressed into clay, were not merely stories for entertainment. They were memories etched into the collective mind of Mesopotamia, reminders of how fragile civilization was in the face of the rivers that gave it life. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was both a gift and a threat. Each year, the rivers flooded unpredictably. Sometimes the waters nourished the fields, spreading fertile silt across the plains. Other times, they raged with sudden violence, tearing away homes, drowning crops, and leaving famine in their wake. To live in Sumer was to live with the constant awareness that survival hung on the mood of the rivers. It is little wonder, then, that the Sumerians imagined a flood so vast it consumed the entire world, a cosmic echo of the disasters they experienced generation after generation. One of the oldest surviving references to this myth comes from the Sumerian King List, a remarkable text that blends history with legend. It records the names of rulers who reigned before the flood, assigning them impossibly long lifespans, thousands of years each. Then comes the chilling line: the flood swept over the land. After this, kingship was said to have descended again from heaven, beginning anew in the city of Kish. For the Sumerians, the flood was not just a story, it was a dividing line in history, separating a mythical age of giants and demigods from the fragile reality of their own world. The story appears most vividly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved centuries later in Akkadian form. There, a man named Utnapishtim recounts how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. One god, Ea, warned him, instructing him to build a massive boat, fill it with animals, and preserve life. For 7 days, the waters raged, and the world was swallowed in chaos. When the waters receded, Utnapishtim released birds to search for dry land, much as Noah would in the later Hebrew tradition. The parallels are unmistakable, suggesting that the Sumerian flood story flowed across cultures, reshaped by each but carrying the same core memory of destruction and renewal. But what did this story mean to the people who first told it? For the Sumerians, the flood was both warning and comfort. It explained why life was so precarious, why cities rose only to fall, why fields could be abundant one year and barren the next. It also offered a pattern of hope, destruction followed by rebirth. Just as the flood swept away the old world, a new one could begin. In a land where collapse was a constant threat, the myth reassured them that renewal was always possible. The flood story also carried political weight. By tracing kingship back to a time before the flood, rulers could claim that their authority was part of a divine cycle. Their reigns were not accidents of history, but continuations of a pattern that stretched back into myth. To rule after the flood was to inherit the rebirth of civilization itself. In this way, the story bound myth, history, and politics into a single narrative that justified the structures of power. Daily life echoed the anxieties that fed the flood myth. Farmers prayed for moderate waters, neither too much nor too little. Families built homes of mud brick that could be swept away in a single season, always aware that permanence was an illusion. Priests performed rituals to appease the river gods, hoping to tame their unpredictable power. Each flood season carried echoes of the cosmic flood, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Archaeology adds a haunting dimension to the myth. Excavations at sites like Shuruppak and reveal layers of river silt separating levels of habitation, suggesting that catastrophic floods did indeed strike Mesopotamian cities. For those who lived through them, the devastation would have felt apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods destroyed, fields ruined, and populations displaced. Such events, magnified in memory and retelling, could easily give rise to stories of a flood that once engulfed the entire world. And so, the Great Flood Tablet, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, reveals the heart of Sumerian thought. The attempt to impose meaning on a chaotic world. Where laws sought to bring order to human disputes, myths sought to explain the uncontrollable forces of nature. Both were pressed into clay, preserved for centuries, and carried forward into the traditions of later civilizations. But as we pause here, one question remains at the edge of the story, lapping like the waters of the Tigris against the banks. Was the flood truly a memory of one cataclysmic event? Or was it a story born from countless smaller disasters, shaped into myth so that people could endure the uncertainty of their world? Once the Sumerians began pressing their flood myths into clay, those stories did not remain confined to their own cities. Like the rivers that carried goods across Mesopotamia, myths too began to flow outward, reshaping themselves as they entered new lands and cultures. What began as a Sumerian memory of swollen rivers and ruined fields became one of the most enduring stories in human history, retold in Babylon, Assyria, Canaan, and eventually in the Hebrew scriptures. The earliest Sumerian versions emphasize the fragility of human life before the gods. Humanity's fate was often at the mercy of divine moods. In one telling, the gods grew weary of human noise and decided to silence the world with a flood. In another, overpopulation or disobedience provoked divine wrath. Always the flood came as punishment, a sweeping erasure of human pride. Yet in each version, survival rested on a single chosen figure. A man warned by the gods, tasked with preserving life in a great boat. This figure first appears in Sumerian sources as Ziusudra, then in Akkadian texts as Atrahasis, and later in Babylonian and Assyrian retellings as Utnapishtim. Across cultures, his name changes, but his role remains the same, the lone survivor who carries humanity into the next age. The Babylonian version of the myth, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, adds layers of emotion and reflection. Utnapishtim, the survivor, becomes a figure of wisdom, one who has looked death in the face and lived. When Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, seeks immortality, it is Utnapishtim who tells him the flood story. In this framing, the flood is not only about destruction and renewal, but also about the limits of human ambition. Even kings cannot escape mortality. Only the gods decide who lives and who dies. The flood becomes a lesson about humility in the face of forces larger than humanity. The story also found resonance outside Mesopotamia. Archaeologists and scholars note strong parallels between the Mesopotamian flood narratives and the account of Noah in the Hebrew Bible. The ark, the animals, the release of birds, the covenant after the waters recede. These elements echo almost directly from older Mesopotamian traditions. Yet, each retelling reshaped the myth for its own audience. In the Hebrew version, the flood became not only a tale of divine wrath, but also a moral framework. God destroyed the world for its corruption, but preserved Noah as a symbol of righteousness. In this way, the myth carried not only memory, but also moral instruction, turning environmental catastrophe into a spiritual warning. Why did this story spread so widely? Partly because floods were a universal experience. Across the ancient world, communities near rivers and coasts faced the terror of waters that could destroy in hours what had taken generations to build. The story resonated because it explained the inexplicable, why suffering and destruction came suddenly, why innocence and guilt alike were swept away, and why survival was so rare. At the same time, it gave people a way to imagine continuity. If one family could endure, then perhaps their own community could too. The flood myth also reflected deep anxieties about human limits. The Sumerians and their neighbors lived in cities they had built with their own hands, ruled by kings and sustained by laws. Yet all of this could vanish in a single storm. Myths of the flood were reminders that no matter how high their ziggurats climbed, or how carefully they measured their laws, human beings were still fragile in the face of nature and divine will. The myth carried a paradox: pride in human achievement, and terror that it could all be undone. These stories were not static. Priests and scribes adapted them to new contexts. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood becomes part of a larger cycle of divine human tension, with gods attempting various plagues and disasters before finally resorting to a flood. In this version, the story explains not only destruction, but also the origins of sacrifice and worship, since after the flood, the gods demand offerings to prevent future calamities. Thus, the myth was woven directly into ritual practice, ensuring its survival not only in clay tablets, but in daily religious life. Even in their most detailed versions, the flood myths carried ambiguity. Was the destruction punishment or cleansing? Was survival a reward for piety or simply the result of divine whim? The lack of certainty may have been part of their endurance. They allowed each generation to see its own struggles in the story, a warning for the arrogant, a comfort for the suffering, a reminder for the humble. In the bustling streets of Mesopotamian cities, these myths circulated alongside laws and records. A merchant might hear the story told during a festival. A farmer might recall it as floods threatened his fields. A king might invoke it to emphasize his divine mandate. The flood was more than a story. It was a mirror of existence, reflecting both fear and hope. And so, as the myth traveled across time and cultures, It became one of the great unifying narratives of humanity. From Ziusudra to Atrahasis to Utnapishtim to Noah, the flood survivor stood as a symbol of endurance in the face of annihilation. Yet the question remained for the Sumerians who first told it, and it lingers for us still. Did the flood myth preserve memory of a single event that scarred humanity's past? Or was it a timeless reflection of our awareness that everything we build can be washed away in a moment? The flood myth did not vanish with the Sumerians. It lived on in the tablets they pressed, in the hymns they sang, and in the rituals they performed. Later peoples, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hebrews, and Greeks, reshaped it, but at its core it always returned to the same haunting truth. Humanity builds, the waters rise, and survival is never guaranteed. No other story from the ancient Near East achieved such universal reach, because no other reflected so clearly the precarious balance between order and destruction that defined early civilization. Archaeological discoveries lend weight to these ancient fears. At Shurupak, a city mentioned in flood traditions, excavators uncovered a thick layer of river silt, separating older and newer levels of habitation. Similar flood deposits have been found in other Mesopotamian sites. These findings suggest that catastrophic floods were not mere imagination. They were lived experiences. Entire communities may have been swept away, forcing survivors to rebuild from ruins. To those who lived through them, the devastation would have felt total, as if the world itself had ended. Over generations, memory of these disasters may have merged, forming the myth of a flood so vast it consumed everything. Yet the power of the story was not only in fear, but also in renewal. In every version, survival was possible. Whether it was Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, or Noah, one family endured, carrying animals and seeds into the future. The flood wiped away corruption, but allowed life to begin again. For the Sumerians, this cycle mirrored the rhythm of their rivers. Each year the floods destroyed and restored, bringing both death and fertility. To imagine a cosmic flood was to imagine this natural rhythm expanded to the scale of the entire world. It was terrifying, but also reassuring. After chaos, order returns. The flood myth also shaped how ancient peoples thought about divine justice. In the Sumerian and Akkadian versions, the gods destroyed humanity for reasons that sometimes seemed arbitrary: noise, disobedience, overpopulation. This reflected the unpredictability of life in Mesopotamia, where disaster often struck without warning. In later retellings, like the Hebrew account, the flood became moralized. God punished humanity for wickedness, but saved the righteous. Over time, the story evolved from a tale of cosmic chaos to a framework for divine morality. This shift reveals how myths adapt, carrying forward old memories while meeting the spiritual needs of new generations. What is striking is how writing preserved these stories. Without clay tablets, the memory of the flood might have faded like countless other oral traditions. But because scribes pressed the words into clay, the myth endured for millennia, crossing cultures and languages. When archaeologists uncovered the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh in the 19th century, the flood story stunned the modern world with its similarities to biblical accounts. Suddenly, the voices of ancient Mesopotamia spoke again, reminding us that long before our own religions and philosophies, people had already wrestled with questions of destruction, survival, and renewal. The endurance of the flood story shows us that myths are not idle fantasies, but tools of survival. They carry memory across generations, helping people endure trauma and make sense of loss. For the Sumerians, the flood explained why their world was fragile. For later cultures, it explained why humans must live morally. Today, it reminds us of the deep continuity of human fear and hope. The details differ, but the essence remains. Humanity builds, nature overwhelms, and life clings to survival through memory and story. And so, the Great Flood Tablet is more than an artifact. It is a window into humanity's oldest anxieties and oldest resilience. The rivers may have changed their courses, the cities may have crumbled, but the myth flows still, carried in scriptures, stories, and cultural memory across continents. Like the waters it describes, it refuses to be contained. As we leave this story, one thought lingers. Do we retell the flood because we fear another will come, or because we need to believe that even if it does, someone will survive to tell the story again? When the waters receded after floods, the people of Sumer faced not only devastation, but also opportunity. The very force that could destroy their homes also left behind fertile soil, rich with silt, ready to yield crops. Yet survival was never guaranteed, for the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were as unpredictable as they were generous. They could rise suddenly, sweeping away villages, or dry into trickles, leaving fields cracked with drought. Between these extremes, the farmers of Mesopotamia forged one of humanity's earliest and most enduring experiments: irrigation. To imagine daily life in Sumer is to picture endless labor under a burning sun. Men and women spent their lives carving channels into the ground, digging ditches with tools of wood and copper, and piling mud into embankments. Children carried baskets of earth, while elders oversaw the flow of water from one field to another. Water was wealth, and to control it was to control survival itself. The system was simple in design, yet immense in effort. Canals drew river water into reservoirs, dikes kept floods at bay, and sluices released water into fields of barley and wheat. Every season, maintenance was required. Without constant attention, canals collapsed, weeds grew, and the system failed. The choice of crops itself reflected the river's cycles. Barley became the staple because it could tolerate both salinity and irregular flooding. Wheat was grown too, but it was less forgiving. Alongside these grains, farmers planted dates, flax, and vegetables, creating a varied, though precarious diet. Domesticated animals, goats, sheep, oxen, were tied to this system, grazing on the stubble left behind after harvest. Nothing went to waste, for survival allowed no luxury of neglect. The organization of irrigation required cooperation. No single family could manage a canal system alone. Villages and cities had to coordinate labor, dividing responsibilities among households and assigning officials to monitor flow. Records show that temple authorities often oversaw irrigation, linking water management to religion and politics. Priests claimed the rivers as gifts of the gods, and by controlling canals, they reinforced their authority. To refuse work on the canals was to endanger the community and to risk divine displeasure. Thus, water was not only a resource, but also a foundation of social order. Daily rhythms followed the river's demands. At dawn, farmers walked the embankments, checking for leaks. Children drove animals to graze, while women prepared meals from stored grain. When planting began, families worked side by side, dropping seeds into furrows softened by irrigation. Later, during harvest, sickles of flint and bronze cut the golden stalks, which were tied into bundles and stacked in the fields. Grain was then threshed, winnowed, and carried to granaries. These acts, repeated generation after generation, formed the quiet backbone of civilization. Yet with control came new problems. Irrigation, though life-giving, carried the hidden danger of salinization. As water evaporated under the fierce Mesopotamian sun, salts remained in the soil, gradually poisoning the land. Over centuries, yields diminished, forcing communities to shift from wheat to barley, then sometimes abandoning fields altogether. This slow degradation was invisible at first, but its consequences were lasting. It shaped migrations, economic decline, and even political upheavals. Behind the grand myths of kings and gods lay these quiet struggles with soil, salt, and water. The work of irrigation also created inequality. Those who lived near main canals had easier access to water, while those farther away relied on secondary channels. If upstream communities diverted too much, downstream farmers suffered. Disputes over water were common, recorded in early laws and contracts. Some of the earliest legal codes in history, including those from Ur and later Hammurabi, contain detailed rules about canal maintenance and water rights. These laws, etched into clay, show how survival required not just labor, but also regulation, compromise, and enforcement. In this way, the rivers shaped not only the land, but also the very structure of society. From temples to palaces, from scribes to farmers, all were tied to the canals. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every offering to the gods depended on this fragile system. The myth of the flood may have warned of divine destruction, but irrigation was the daily reality, the endless battle to bend water to human will without losing control. As we look back, one question emerges. Did irrigation truly give the Sumerians mastery over their environment, or did it bind them into an endless cycle of labor, dependence, and decline that no myth could ever fully explain? The management of water in ancient Mesopotamia was not merely about digging ditches, it was about shaping human destiny. As the canals grew longer and the networks more complex, the burden of coordination grew heavier. Entire cities could not survive without collective labor, and the sheer scale of irrigation demanded an authority that could plan, command, and enforce. From this necessity, political structures emerged, not abstractly, but literally out of the mud and reeds that lined the riverbanks. At first, temples acted as the core of this system. The priests, claiming divine insight, directed the construction of canals and distributed the harvest that followed. The temple's storerooms filled with grain, wool, and oil, not as mere offerings, but as taxes collected for the maintenance of irrigation. Through this control, religious leaders secured both economic and spiritual authority. To dig a canal was to serve the gods, and to serve the gods was to ensure the prosperity of the fields. The ritual and the practical became inseparable. But as villages expanded into cities, and as disputes over water multiplied, the need for stronger, more centralized power grew. Kings rose to prominence not only as warriors, but also as managers of rivers. In their inscriptions, rulers often boasted less of battles and more of canals built, embankments raised, or reservoirs enlarged. To be a good king was to be a master of water, for without controlled irrigation, no palace or army could be sustained. Some kings even bore titles that reflected this role: guardians of dikes, providers of abundance. Their legitimacy rested as much on grain as on conquest. The codification of law further reveals how deeply irrigation structured society. The Code of Ur-Nammu, and later the more famous Code of Hammurabi, contained numerous regulations about water use. They prescribed fines for neglecting canal maintenance, penalties for diverting water unlawfully, and compensation for damages caused by mismanagement. These laws, carved into stone, show how survival in Mesopotamia depended on shared rules. Water was too valuable to leave to chance, and justice itself was framed through its distribution. Beneath this order, however, tensions simmered. Upstream farmers sometimes diverted more than their share, leaving downstream communities desperate. Drought years intensified these conflicts. Records from city archives describe petitions, lawsuits, and even local uprisings sparked by irrigation disputes. One farmer's blocked canal could mean another's famine. Thus, the same system that bound society together also sowed division, creating hierarchies of access and constant negotiation. Religion reinforced obedience to this system. The rivers were seen as sacred, their floods as signs of divine will. Deities, such as Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters, were invoked in hymns and offerings to bless the flow of canals. Seasonal festivals marked the sowing and harvesting cycles, binding human labor to cosmic rhythms. By placing irrigation within a sacred framework, leaders ensured that disobedience was not merely a civic fault, but a spiritual danger. To neglect canal work was to risk the anger of gods, who could withhold rains or unleash destructive floods. The daily toil of farmers was thus woven into a vast web of politics and ritual. A man who dug earth from a canal was not only feeding his family, he was contributing to the survival of the entire city. His labor kept temple granaries filled, sustained armies on campaign, and provided offerings to the gods. Every furrow, every channel carried the weight of civilization. Yet behind the great temples and palaces, the work remained grueling and unending. Generations passed with little change. Fathers teaching sons how to strengthen embankments, mothers passing down the knowledge of planting cycles, communities repeating the same burdens year after year. Still, this struggle also brought remarkable achievements. Cities such as Lagash, and Uruk flourished because of their irrigation systems. They became centers of trade, art, and learning, built on the backs of farmers who bent rivers to their will. Clay tablets from scribes recorded harvests, contracts, and disputes, leaving behind a written legacy of ordinary labor that underpinned extraordinary monuments. Without irrigation, there would have been no ziggurats, no literature, no empires. Water, silent and relentless, was the true foundation of civilization. Yet one cannot escape the irony. The more Mesopotamians mastered their environment, the more dependent they became upon it. Each new canal expanded their reach, but also increased the burden of maintenance. Each new field promised abundance, but also demanded vigilance against salinization and drought. The system tied them to the land as securely as any chain. The flood myth, with its sweeping destruction, may have warned of sudden catastrophe, but the canals told a quieter truth. Survival required endless vigilance, with no promise of rest. And so, one is left to wonder, was the rise of kings and temples a triumph of human ingenuity, or merely the price of living in a land where rivers demanded obedience every single season? As centuries passed, the once thriving cities of Mesopotamia began to confront the slow, silent cost of their own success. Irrigation, which had lifted them to prosperity, carried within it the seeds of decline. Year after year, as water evaporated under relentless heat, salts accumulated in the soil. At first, the effects were subtle. A reduced harvest here, a shift in crops there. But over generations, the land itself began to betray those who depended on it. Wheat fields, once abundant, gave way to barley, which tolerated salt but yielded less variety in diet. Eventually, even barley struggled, and fields that had fed thousands lay barren, crusted white with minerals. The consequences rippled far beyond the fields. Temples that had once overflowed with offerings found their storerooms growing empty. Palaces that had promised abundance faced shortages, and rulers could no longer boast of overflowing granaries. The gods, once praised for sending fertility, were accused of withholding their favor. Priests staged more elaborate rituals. Kings claimed greater authority, yet the basic problem lay not in heaven, but in the ground beneath their feet. The canals that once symbolized triumph had become pathways to exhaustion. Archaeological evidence shows that some cities were gradually abandoned as soil became unusable. Populations shifted toward regions less affected by salinity, leaving behind ruins that spoke of both greatness and fragility. The fate of cities such as Ur and Lagash was not sealed in dramatic battles alone, but in the steady erosion of agricultural sustainability. In this sense, the rise and fall of Mesopotamian civilization was as much an ecological story as a political one. Control over rivers had given life, but it could not permanently overcome nature's limits. This decline did not happen uniformly. Some regions adapted better, developing new techniques or redirecting their canals to fresher soil. Others suffered prolonged hardship, sparking migrations, conflicts, and even conquests. Empires rose on the promise of managing water more effectively, only to falter when the same problems reappeared. The Akkadian Empire, for instance, expanded across Mesopotamia, but was undermined by drought and soil exhaustion. Centuries later, Babylon rose to prominence, boasting grand canals and fertile lands, only to confront the same old struggle against water's double-edged nature. Yet amid this cycle of rise and decline, resilience remained. People adjusted their diets, relying more heavily on dates, fish, and livestock when grains grew scarce. Families passed down careful knowledge about which fields to rest, which to flood, and which to abandon. Trade expanded as cities sought food from beyond their borders, linking Mesopotamia to distant lands. Even in decline, the ingenuity of its people never fully disappeared. They endured by bending, adapting, and moving, even as their environment resisted their efforts. Beyond survival, irrigation left another legacy: knowledge. The need to manage water inspired advances in mathematics, surveying, and record-keeping. Clay tablets reveal calculations of fields and canals, contracts governing water rights, and instructions for maintenance. Scribes refined the art of writing in part to keep track of agricultural systems, making irrigation one of the hidden engines behind the invention of cuneiform. What began as simple marks on clay to track grain rations became the foundation of written history itself. In this way, the farmers' struggle with rivers shaped not only their own lives, but the future of human civilization. The memory of irrigation also lived on in stories. Flood myths and hymns carried lessons about dependence on water and the dangers of imbalance. Kings continued to proclaim their role as providers of fertility, even as canals demanded constant toil. Ordinary families, though rarely mentioned in inscriptions, formed the true backbone of these societies. Their sweat sustained the grandeur of empires, and their daily labor kept temples supplied with offerings. Without them, no ziggurat would have risen, no epic would have been sung, no law code would have been inscribed. As we step back and view the sweep of Mesopotamian history, one truth becomes clear. The rivers were never truly conquered. They could be managed, redirected, and channeled, but never mastered. Human ambition carved canals into the earth, yet water continued to follow its own course, indifferent to human hopes. The story of Mesopotamian irrigation is not simply one of progress or decline. It is the story of a delicate balance, forever tested and never fully secured. And so, a question lingers across the ruins of ancient canals and the silent fields they once nourished. Did the farmers of Mesopotamia create civilization through their mastery of rivers, or did the rivers themselves, through their unpredictable cycles, shape the very destiny of humanity in ways no human hand could control?